as we continue to explore the recent ICE involvement in Minneapolis and nationwide, we became curious. What authority do police, ICE, and other law enforcement officers have to use deadly force? What protocols, guidelines do they use to make the decisions that they make? And what rights do we individuals have when they are stopped by or pursued by law enforcement? To help us understand all these issues, we're joined by Dr. Beth Gilmore, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Houston downtown. Dr. Gilmore, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
I guess a lot of people are concerned with not just how to behave in these situations. There become the questions of what's legal and not legal, and whether or not that's even being upheld in these situations, which then builds on the stress of what to do if you find yourself confronted or asked or questioned or involved in any of these incidents we've been seeing. Huge topic to digest, but I guess where would you start in helping people understand what's happening?
Okay, so I think that that there's a lot going on when we see an incident like this, particularly one that gets national attention. You know, it's upsetting. Mm-hmm. It's upsetting for people to see, right? I mean, someone loses their life, law enforcement's engaging in deadly force, and you know, oftentimes the first time that anyone interacts with law enforcement is when they're in a situation where they're actually interacting with them, right? There's not many practice classes, right, that we get taught in school or in education. And so actually, as part of my outreach at University of Houston downtown, I've actually taught high school students what to do when pulled over by law enforcement. I think it's one of those things that we don't think about until we're in that situation. And so, you know, talking about basic things such as, now this is not applicable to the specific example involving this ICE agent, but, you know, for example, when you get pulled over, some individuals think automatically that they need to get their ID ready, get their insurance ready, right? And so before the officer approaches their vehicle, they're scrambling to try to get materials. And to law enforcement, that can look like they're scrambling to get a weapon, potentially, right? And so having those kinds of conversations, but when I talk to average teenagers, oftentimes they'll tell me, well, my parents told me it's disrespectful not to have my stuff ready for the police. I need to have my stuff ready, right? And so having these conversations, I think, are really important. And I think in this situation, what we see is kind of a snapshot of a few seconds of interaction where you have two people who are both in really elevated states of, you know, having a sympathetic nervous response, right? Adrenaline's pumping, right? You know, you have an officer who is, you know, standing, you know, kind of in front of to the side of a vehicle. You have a driver who looks like they're trying to get away, right? And, you know, that situation is a high stress situation. So you're talking about a few seconds of interactions in a very brief situation.
But take me outside of what happened in that particular incident. And I'm more curious, even to start with, what is the difference between what a police officer can do and what an ICE officer can do? Where are we? I think we are most trained, like you said, how to behave if a police officer approaches your car and what you should do and how you should react. Do ICE agents come with all the same authority? Do they have more authority? Do they have less? Do they need the same warrants? Do they need the same? Help us understand the difference even at that basic level.
Okay, so there's quite a few. So when you're talking about federal agencies, a lot of times there's idiosyncratic factors related to what they're doing. On a broad level, you know, they operate very similar to law enforcement. So they get a lot of the same training, you know, in terms of the different things that they do. It's just oftentimes what they're enforcing versus not, right? So they're not engaging in, you know, typical traffic, you know, stops and things like that.
And that's what I was going to say. That's exactly what I was thinking in my line of thought is that, you know, Dr. Gilmore, if a police officer pulls you over, you see their car, it's usually, you understand, you're in the street, the lights go on. There's this natural rhythm and protocol. What we're seeing within ICE is that there isn't necessarily that same feeling of a natural protocol. So if somebody is pulling you over, what should citizens understand is this new place of protocols when we look at ICE specifically?
So, I mean, I think that, and this has been a concern for, I don't want to be stereotypical, but for female drivers for a long time,
Yes.
right? You get pulled over by an unmarked vehicle or an
Correct.
undercover officer, right? And you're like, is this a cop or is this someone who's going to put me in their trunk, right?
Exactly.
I don't know what to do,
Yes.
right? And so I think that's a really valid concern. And so I think, and it's easy to say, right? But it's a lot harder to practice. But I think one of the things that's really key in these situations is trying your best to remain calm, right? So I think the first thing that happens is and I'll be the first one to admit, I've spent my career working in various law enforcement agencies. I knew officers, and when I would see the lights go on behind me, I'd get nervous.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's a really
Same.
natural response to get nervous.
Well, you
I
think
the
you're in trouble.
Right.
Right. So that's my question. Who can tell me to get out of the car and I have to get out of the car?
Yeah.
Can an ICE agent tell me to get out of the car and I have to get out of the car? Or is that reserved for cops and state troopers and constables?
It depends on the situation.
Well, see, now that
right.
doesn't help.
Right.
I mean, that became a deadly situation with Renee Good. It was a situation where it looked like she was trying to maybe prevent people from going back into the neighborhood. I don't know what she was doing, but her car was askew on the icy road, and they were telling her to get out of the car. Did she have to get out of the car and didn't do it?
In that situation, I mean, again, I think there's going to be more information that comes out, right? But at a baseline, like what I'm looking at, because there was an investigation going on, right? They do have the authority, law enforcement does have the authority to temporarily tell you to get out of a vehicle.
Even ICE.
They
What
do.
about National Guard?
I don't even know if National Guard's engaging in traffic stops. I mean, they can give a directive as a law enforcement official and have an expectation that civilians follow it, and so, or citizens, right, that follow that.
It just seems like if you're in a uniform with a gun, I have to do what you say.
So here's the thing, is that I think that a lot of times that these situations kind of, I would like to see like the whole of what happened that day, right? So I don't think that there's a proclivity for law enforcement just to walk up and be like, hey, you, out of the car, right? That kind of a thing, right?
Right.
So, was there something that, and I don't know, I'm speculating, okay? Was there something that was going on that made them think that maybe there's something concerning going on in this vehicle? Maybe there's something impeding an investigation, And so did they ask questions earlier and she refused to answer or refused to give information? And so, here's the other thing too, right? Law enforcement's also responsible for all the other people in that's a residential area, right? So if someone's doing something and it's, concerning or suspicious or impeding the investigation, they also have to make sure like other people are safe too, right? So coming up and engaging with someone, and again, I don't know because I haven't seen all the footage, right? We only get snippets, and that stinks, right? When we're trying to be objective. But if there was something going on that was concerning, and then they said, hey, what's going on? How you doing? Because most of the time, right, when we get stopped, right, by law enforcement, it's, they come up, they say who they are, they say do you know why I pulled you over today? Right, it's kind of the standard speech, right? And so, but in those types of situations, I'd like to see the whole.
So,
right.
But if we take it away from that particular situation, because we're all seeing lots of different videos of different things, which on the surface look very aggressive and not following what we would assume are protocols that should be in place. That could very well be from only seeing parts of videos and also not understanding what those protocols are. But there's also concern, are they being, the agents that we're seeing do this, are they properly trained? What authority do they have? What kind of warrants are they carrying with them? Do they have to produce that? What do you have to produce? I've seen videos that say, do not answer any of their questions. Do not say anything. If they come to your home and knock on your door, don't even respond from inside the house, because once you respond from inside the house, then they have authority to come in. I don't understand any of this.
I read they are not law enforcement. ICE agents are not law enforcement.
Help us understand those finite, and I know there's a whole lot we're throwing out at once, but pick and choose. Help me understand if I find myself in a situation like this. If there is a pounding at my door and they say, ICE, open up, what am I legally responsible to do? And I understand there's a difference between what the law says and what may be happening in practice out on the streets today. but legally, help me understand that.
Okay, so that's a really good question, and we've seen this locally in Houston, right?
Right.
And we've also seen this even in law enforcement with Houston, right? If you remember, multiple years ago, there was a big controversy with the Houston Police Department and the use of no-knock warrants.
Yes.
Right, and then we had policy change related to that, because what they found was like people were getting hurt. They were in places they shouldn't be, right? Even though they were authorized with the warrants, right? That there was false information backing those warrants, right? And so I would even go so far to say that there's even situations where a warrant is issued, whether it's to a law enforcement agency or to federal agencies or officers that are carrying out tasks, where there's concern, right? But that's retroactively. Right. And so as a citizen, right, as someone who's engaging with law enforcement, and whether it be local municipal police, state officials like Texas Rangers, in Texas we have Rangers, right, or it be, federal officials, my advice is always to be very calm. I know that it's much easier to say because I get nervous. Okay, so I'm here to tell you, I get nervous. Okay, so but to stay as calm as possible in terms of their directives. You are advised to follow directives, but in terms of questions where they're asking for permission for certain things. So, for example, this is common practice on traffic stops to say, is it okay if I search your car? Is it okay if I look through your car? Right? We've seen a ton of cases throughout Houston. I don't know if you know this, but years ago, Harris County led in exonerations in the country, which was shocking, right? Because of a lot of drug-related exonerations where they tested materials that they thought were drugs from people's cars that they admitted they thought were drugs, but they weren't drugs. But it was mostly related to these consent to searches, right? I personally would not consent to a search. If it's a consensual question, I certainly wouldn't do that. Now, should you get a knock on your door? Right? It's a different situation, your residence. You are certainly allowed to ask, for what information they have. Like, is there warrants? Is there someone specific they're looking for? And also to understand, the parameters of that warrant. So in some cases, they're looking for a person. Right? So they're looking for a specific individual that may be in that residence. In those situations, they're not permitted to, for example, dig through your drawers in your house, right? They can't, go through those. So it's perfectly okay to ask.
And I think that is a question that I personally have. So, for example, if I'm at home with my children, and also I think women have different set of standards of feeling protective of themselves and of their family. If somebody comes and knocks at my door and it's these two, big men, they're masked, I don't have anything to hide. If they come and they knock at my door and they say, it's ICE, we want to come inside, it becomes a power struggle if I say, well, no, can I see some type of identification? Do they have to legally show me any type of identification before they come into my house? Or do they say, no, we're ICE, we want to come into your house?
Okay, so there's a couple of different scenarios here to think about. So there are circumstances in which when law enforcement perceives an imminent danger, right? Okay. So kind of a textbook case that I may be dating myself here, but I'm gonna use it. Okay, I'm gonna go with it because they just did a reboot on Netflix. Okay, so we're gonna go with it. Okay, everyone here will know what I'm talking about. But the O.J. Simpson case,
Yes.
Right? So when you think about the homicide scene being located by law enforcement and them recognizing that one of the victims was the separated spouse of O.J. Simpson, right? Officers made way to his residence and then observed some things outside that they thought were a little concerning and made entry, right, into the grounds of O.J.'s residence at the time because they thought, well, my gosh, she's dead, he could be hurt too, right? And that's the legal parameters of something like that. Right. So in a situation like that where they think that someone inside can be hurt, or there's reasonable information to believe
to
that
come inside,
right?
They can force them away inside,
right? If they think and again, I think that a lot of time, and this is I think it's whenever you see these citizen interactions with law enforcement in any capacity, and someone gets hurt. It's tragic.
Yes.
It's just sad. No,
Yes.
we don't want to see that, right? We don't want to see that. And I think it's really easy to look back and say, oh, well, maybe we should have done this. But I mean, you don't know. You don't know people's story. You don't know what happened. You don't know if they've been scared, any of those things, right? So I think, when you're looking at that situation, there can be a lot. And when you're talking about being a female, I think, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I need to see some identification. Is there someone I can call? Like, I'm scared,
I'm a little concerned.
I've had officers knock on my house in the middle of the night at times, right? In my personal residence because, they hear something or they're looking
What
for
did you do?
I know. We'll talk about that off air.
Well, I want to talk about this really quick, that we're talking to Dr.
sure.
Beth Gilmore, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at University of Houston Downtown. If you have questions about what we're talking about, give us a call, 713-440-8870. You were just saying, Celeste, in the questioning there, and it's, does ICE have investigatory powers or just retention powers? Like, are they there to investigate a crime or are they there to apprehend an individual? And the difference of their mission then I think would imply what they can do if they enter your home.
Right. So here's the thing is that sometimes in the course of apprehension, they get information that is investigatory in nature, right?
Okay.
So because people will give them information, right? They'll tell them things or, and it's in both capacities, right? People will tell them things that's, exonerative of nature, right? So, oh no, that person hasn't been here in a long time. Now they live here, right? Or they, or whatever it may be, right? And so I think through the course of action, right, that they can be involved in those capacities. It's kind of like when you think about state troopers, right, in the state of Texas, right? I think the average motorist would think about troopers as if troopers are people that pull people over for speeding, right? I mean, and you see the hat come out and you're like, oh, I'm getting a ticket. Right. You just know I'm getting a ticket. Right. But sometimes when they're involved, like there's a big, there's a really interesting data recently about troopers getting involved in like trafficking initiatives because they do so many traffic contacts that they'll see, at-risk teenagers being trafficked. And so now they've shifted because, yes, they're involved in the traffic and that's their primary responsibility. But because they're now stopping this vehicle and they find a 13-year-old kid that's run away 3 times, now they're investigatory and they have the ability to do that. So I think you're thinking about like primary contact and primary goal versus this sometimes secondary consequence. Now, ICE does work closely with law enforcement, right? So they're often working in tandem with the local municipal or county, depending on the location that they're in, right?
Celeste had mentioned, too, if they're at her door, can I see the warrant? I need to see a warrant. There are 2 different kinds. There's administrative and judicial warrants. They carry one, police carry the other, or they mean different things. Can you really quickly sum up the difference between the 2?
Well, I think it's kind of nuanced. So it's difficult to, but when you're talking about, and you have the right to see both. I think like if we're talking about how we're going to work with listeners to help them understand this, is that they're allowed to see both. Now, in terms of what the variances are, again, because there's just so much right now, I don't want to get into the nuances of it.
But do they have to show the warrant? Or can they just say they have one?
That has been done before. So again, I would say that the law enforcement should, if they want to get cooperation, right, they should be forthcoming with what they have, okay? Now, has that always been the practice? Absolutely not, right? And so we know that. We know that that has not always been the practice. And I will also tell you this, the standard of privacy is constantly evolving through Supreme Court justices and perceptions. And I think that's something we have to be aware of with like, technology is moving so fast, right? So with GPS and tracking and monitoring devices and cameras outside of people's houses. And so I personally feel like our expectation of privacy is constantly being pulled back more and more and more because of all these things that allow us to be tracked in those things, right? So that's constantly evolving too. So I would also say if this is something that is on your mind heavily, to always stay like aware of what's going on with current legislation, current executive orders, current federal, legislation, because it changes all the time.
Well, come back and tell us when it changes.
Dr. Beth Gilmore is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Houston downtown. Dr. Gilmore, thank you so much for joining us today on Hello Houston.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.